The Hate Obama Party. Let's play hardball. Good evening, I'm Chris Matthews in Washington. Let me start tonight with this. This hatred of the president has sunk deeper and deeper into the Republican bloodstream. To be a member of the GOP in November 2013 is to be a member of the HOP, the Hate Obama Party. You must not only oppose him, the political leader, but everything with his name on it. You must not only hate the president's health care plan, you must support any act of sabotage you get your hands on. The goal is to blow up the program anywhere you lay the landmine. Whether by denying people information, refusing to have your state participate, talking to young people into how to avoid accountability. This is exactly what the president's enemies have been doing since they first learned of his election. Just as the southern states began moving towards secession in the victory of Abraham Lincoln, those with the same mentality today began meeting on ways to sabotage this new president's program even before he uttered it. Well, tonight, the Hate Obama Party in all its anger and misery. David Corn is the Washington Bureau Chief of Mother Jones, and Ron Reagan is former radio talk show host. Both are MSNBC contributors. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. This sabotage campaign that was laid out today, Todd Purdive in today's Politico puts together all the pieces of the Republican Party's four-year war to sabotage the Affordable Care Act. He writes, from the moment the bill was introduced, Republican leaders in both houses of Congress announced their intention to kill it. The GOP faithful then kept up their crusade past the president's re-election in a pattern of massive resistance not seen since the southern states' defiance of the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. Well, let's look at just a few instances of the GOP's coordinated attack to derail the president's health care law at all costs. Republicans withhold all support when the law first makes its way through both chambers of the Congress in 2009. In 2010, Scott Brown of Massachusetts wins a special election up there after running a campaign to kill the legislation. His victory gives the GOP 41 votes in the Senate, which gives them the power to block any fixes or improvement in the new law. Once implementation begins, Republican governors across the country refuse to build their own state exchanges, putting unexpected pressure on the federal exchanges. Then congressional Republicans repeatedly refuse to give HHS the money it needs to do all that extra work to build the federal exchange. Then there's the obstruction campaigns. They include GOP darlings like Rush Limbaugh and Dick Morris urging people to do things like avoid tax refunds as a way to skirt the individual mandate, or sign petitions rejecting their state's exchanges. And, of course, there's the GOP icing on the cake, a 2-week government shutdown and a threat to blow up the economy if the health care law isn't dismantled. Pretty strong stuff. Ron Reagan, I want to start with you. This has been a concerted effort. It is very much like when you read about Lincoln coming to Washington through Baltimore and sneaking into town because the secession movement has already begun. They didn't give this guy a honeymoon. They didn't give this guy they didn't give him nothing. They started going after him from the beginning.
No, and they haven't learned their lesson. I mean, you know, they just got their hat handed to them with this government shutdown and the debt ceiling thing, and you'd think maybe they'd be chastened a bit, but they're not. They're just going to keep this up. It's an ideological war they're fighting, where these Tea Party members, they think that government is bad. Not only do they think that Obama's government is bad, any government is bad, so they want government to fail, which is a pretty outrageous thing. Imagine when the Iraq War was getting underway, if Democrats who opposed the war and weren't crazy about George W. Bush to begin with, began denying troops body armor or denying them armored vehicles or things like that. That's the equivalent of what Republicans are doing in the health care bill with not expanding Medicaid, leaving millions of people to suffer without health insurance just because of their ideology.
Yeah, I was wondering, although I don't want to defend all of it, but I tell you, when they start talking about how the president oversold the ease with which we'll get Obamacare, the president's health care plan, the ease with which will come in, weren't they the guys who called the Iraq War a cakewalk?
Cakewalk.
Excuse me, just to remind people what real oversales is all about.
You know, one of the most important points I think Todd makes in his excellent piece in Politico is that the way this town used to work is that when a bill was passed, a big bill, a big program, you knew it would need tweaking along the way. You know, there were unintended consequences. Sometimes you see what happens with the regulations and tax code stuff, and you have to go back in and make what are called technical fixes. And, you know, back in the bygone days, maybe of the days of Tip and Gipper, you know, even if you lost the fight, you'd bring up a bill and say this is all kind of neutral, it's just to make this work better. You could get it passed with both sides saying, okay, you got the program, we want the program to work. That can't happen now. So therefore, Obama and the executive branch...
Explain why, because you can't get 60 votes through the Senate to do anything.
The Republicans would use that as an occasion to block and destroy, to disrupt and obstruct. And so, therefore, the executive branch now and the White House has to do a lot of this through regulations, which they otherwise wouldn't do. And it really sort of, it's like throwing gum into the works quite perfectly.
So all these fixes they demand now, they had an opportunity to deliver on right after they got the first part of the health care plan through with 60 votes. And when they came around through reconciliation, they said, we're not giving you a single vote, so you got to do it that way, therefore you can't change the policy. Anyway, Republicans continue their efforts to undercut the president's authority by blocking two of his nominees for the Supreme Court, or actually for the appellate court yesterday. The first was Representative Mel Watt, the congressman, to head the Federal Housing and Finance Agency. Watt became the first sitting member of Congress blocked for an executive appointment since 1843. The second was Patricia Millett to the D.C. Court of Appeals. I mentioned that. Republicans are holding up her appointment on the ludicrous charge that the president is packing the court, when in reality he's simply filling vacancies. In other words, doing his job. Here's Senator John Corn, a Republican from Texas, using this tortured logic on a conservative radio show early this week.
Well, I think we're going to be successful in stopping this court-packing experiment, and the country will be better for it. I think they ought to let their senators know that courts should not be partisan playthings for any administration, and ask President Obama and the Democratic Majority Leader to stop their court-packing effort.
Ron, John Cornyn is an example of the tail wagging the dog. In normal circumstances, he would be a normal conservative, not a bad guy, normal person trying to do his job in Washington, leading his party to as many victories as they can get. All well and good. And yet he begins to act more like that character that's sitting with him down there from Texas. He begins to imitate like they all do. They all start talking like Mike Lee and Rand Paul because they're scared to death that one of these Udi and Kuseys will look over and actually see them and put, you know, they won't have averted their glance. They're afraid of getting any attention, these people, reasonable right-wing or moderate Republican conservatives, any kind of conservative, unless they're out-and-out Tea Party types. It's really gotten to be the craziest leading everybody else because fear of being tagged, you're not one of us.
You're right. I mean, the guys like Cornyn get led around by the nose by the worst elements in their party. You know, David had mentioned Tip and the Gipper before. I got home from a trip overseas to find that book by a young, up-and-coming political historian named Matthews on my doorstep, and it reminded me, it's very topical, of course, and it reminded me that in the old days, you know, as David was mentioning, you know, you got things done even if you disagreed. Tip O'Neill and my father were about as different as any two people could be, both ideologically, personally, all of that. And yet they understood that America can't stand still, that elections have consequences and the winners get to kind of enact their program. And so, you know, you fight and you dicker and all that sort of stuff. But things have to get done. This Republican Party has decided that the best way to go is to just not let anything happen. Make America stand still for 4 to 8 years.
Yeah, and by the way,
that's a recipe for disaster.
And the craziest thing, thank you for that, by the way, but the thing about it is, David, is the use of the word impeachment. You know, I've been through all the impeachment exercises, like you know, back with Nixon, of course, and it was a tragedy for everybody. It didn't make anybody feel great. It just happened because it had to happen. And then they talk about impeachment for other guys all the time. This time they're talking about it a priori. They don't have a case of particulars. They don't have, you know, articles that they're thinking about. There's no Watergate. There's no Iran-Contra. There's nothing. They just say, let's impeach the SOB. I mean, what is this about?
It's about going as far as you can. They're outside of calling for them to be drawn and quartered. There's not much else you can do. And so, you know, Congressman Steve Stockman, a Tea Party extremist, has sent a book to every member of the House saying...
Well, let's not call these books, okay? They're pamphlets. They're put out by some...
But it's written by a birther.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other thing. It's written by a birther who works for World Net Daily, which is a birther publication website. And you don't see John Boehner or anyone in the Republican Party saying, hey, cut this crap out.
Hey, Ron, I haven't had you on in a while. Do you think there's any sense of self-doubt, dare I raise the issue, with the right wing. When they're talking about this guy who got here from Canada, fair enough, he's natural born by my definition. He's born to an American mother, like their worst case scenario indictment of Obama, born over in Kenya to an American mother. And the guy, and they don't even, and where's Donald Trump in? Where are these birthers in Texas, the half dozen or dozen of them? How do they just embrace this guy who everybody knows was born in Canada? Fair enough, but the same thing, where do they just live in this crazy split-screen world where you just trash a Democrat or a black guy for the same exact thing you worship another guy?
Yes, strange as it seems, yes. The answer is yes. They do live in that kind of split-screen universe. They live in that kind of weird bubble. Yes.
Well, you're in one right now with Ted Cruz, by the way. You're on the right. He's on the left. What do you know? Thank you, Ron Reagan. You're looking good. Ron Reagan joining us tonight, as always. Thank you, David Corn. Coming up, Hillary or